Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Body Wise podcast. I am Laura Mar, and I will be your host today. So it's a very special session today because I think that it's so important to lay the groundwork, the basic understanding of the big topic that my sister and I have decided to dive into for this new season of our podcast. So today, we're going to explore and understand together perimenopause and menopause, essentially, how everyone who menstruates will eventually experience this transition into the end of their cycles. And we are one of the few species that experiences this, where our reproductive years, or what's considered our reproductive years, this cycling hormonally, that is so significant for our overall health and well-being beyond reproduction, because again, that is what it's centered on, but it has multiple effects on our body and our mind and our overall health. So we actually completely transform the way we produce and function with new levels of hormones. And it happens pretty early on in our life compared to how long we are living these days. So we're going to talk about that. And I want to lay out for you just an understanding that most of us don't have. Because as we bring on specialized guests, people who can offer additional insight and beautiful skills and tools and just share their knowledge around specific qualities of this transition and just ways to approach, be it our hormonal health, our sexual health, um, our cognitive function, what it means to grow older. It's not necessarily tied to the experience of menopause. Many people who have their wombs removed, surgically removed at an early age, or have to undergo a chemical menopause, can be really at any age. So it's not necessarily tied to age, but the overarching notion is that there is this association with a loss of vitality and definitely with growing older. And in our society, any gender growing older is going to carry certain stereotypes or assumptions around it. But women, particularly people who identify as women, and the notion of older women has its own flavor, I would say. It's a very specific quality to that experience and the way that it's been viewed through our Western culture and how that influences our experience as a whole of actually growing into our later years, as well as our self-identity and the way we integrate that process and the way we view ourselves, based on that external lens, which inevitably can influence that. So the basic notion here, though, is that most of us don't really understand much about our menstrual cycles. And if we do, we know less about when they will eventually come to an end. But we don't often talk about a very huge transitional phase, which can last up to a decade, which is called perimenopause. So perimenopause is when the ovarian function, like your ovaries and your cycles, begin to just ever so slightly change, because the communication between your brain and your ovaries, which is really the primary communication that triggers full cycle ovulation, menstruation, and then again and again, that repetitive cycle of hormone production, natural sex hormone production in our bodies. It begins to experience a fluctuation, a very specific fluctuation that has nothing to do with an inherent, like a hormonal imbalance because we're stressed or because of the way we're eating or what's happening in our life. Now, all of those things may be true and also be experiencing perimenopause. But what happens in perimenopause is that our ovaries begin responding a little bit more slowly to the brain that's triggering messages for that cycle to get going again and again. So the brain starts speaking just a little bit louder so that those ovaries do hear that signal that triggers estrogen production, and that primary hormone called estrogen, which is so important for our bone health, brain health, skin health, blood sugar regulation, lots of important things, which ultimately triggers ovulation. So because of that, we will start to experience higher levels of estrogen. There's this kind of increased production. Some people refer to it as the last hurrah of the ovaries. And all of a sudden, you may be familiar with the term excess estrogen or estrogen dominance. That's usually based on a sort of a hormonal imbalance, something that's not functioning properly and really needs attention during most of our cyclical years. But towards the end of them, it becomes a new normal, essentially. It's very normal at the very beginning of our cycles when we're teenagers and we just begin to cycle for our estrogen levels to be higher than higher in relation to progesterone. So we would say there's just high estrogen levels because they're not quite balanced out with progesterone, which is the hormone that characterizes the qualities of the second half of our cycle. And those are really the two main hormones, not the only ones, but the two main hormones that we bring under the spotlight when we talk about menstrual cycle health, hormone health. So what happens is that there is a similar quality to the adolescent hormonal years and the perimenopausal years, because there's a lessening of progesterone during perimenopause, and there is an increase of estrogen. Usually what happens first is the increase of estrogen, and then this lessening of progesterone, and ultimately a lessening of estrogen as well. So there will be a double dip, estrogen and progesterone. When during the adolescent years, there is a very high increase of estrogen, and then progesterone isn't dipping, it's actually trying to raise up, trying to build. But that relational imbalance, or that relational estrogen dominance that occurs, that's actually a natural part of developing a healthy, stable cycle. It occurs again, that relational imbalance, as our cycles begin to near their diminishment. So when it comes to understanding what comes up for us during perimenopausal years, and understanding that we tend to be in a high estrogen state, and it's a natural physiological transition, it will eventually pass and it will dip down. And then our body has to kind of kick into an adaptive state. We need to adapt to new levels of lower hormones. And this is something that our body can do, because in many cases, it adapted to higher levels of hormones when we began to cycle. And if pregnancy was part of your journey, the change that happens in our bodies hormonally when we are pregnant, and then when we are no longer pregnant, and there's a very steep dip in hormones, and the body has to recalibrate postpartum, it is a example of a transitional phase, just as breastfeeding and our lowered hormone state, as well as when breastfeeding ends and our hormones increase. If that was part of your journey, you will have experienced this kind of recalibrating, adapting, transforming body that essentially has been doing this kind of fluctuation and adapting throughout our cycles, because we do have weeks or days of higher hormone levels and then weeks or days of lower hormone levels. And again, the body is used to the change. Our bodies are built to adapt and to be cyclical. But now the the phase of our life when we talk about perimenopause and menopause, it is a very deep initiatory transition, just like it is to become, go from being a child with just baseline hormone levels and then transitioning into a cyclical being and then allowing those cycles to fully mature until they're stable and experiencing that dynamic. There's so much to understand about. Number one, it's normal. Number two, the body is giving you signals all the time about what's working and what's not. Hormones tend to be messengers. So, when you listen to those symptoms, the symptoms are leading you to a deeper root. Okay, so if there's swelling, there's inflammation. Why is there inflammation? If there's exhaustion, if there's overstimulation, if someone can't sleep at night anymore, if, sure, there's going to be qualities to this that are, oh, this is different. That's normal. Now, to be in a state of suffering, uncomfortable, cognitive decline, inability to fall asleep, feeling exhausted all the time, that's not normal. So a severe level of symptoms that are related to perimenopause and menopausal change, and the fact that our culture has normalized the severe version of these symptoms, that is what we really need to explore and bring out into the light and say, hey, wait a second. Of course, that's not normal. That's not just the way that it is. And it's not supposed to feel like a decline, and it's not supposed to make living your life difficult and doing your job and, doing the things that you love impossible. It's not time to just give up on that because of menopause or because you've reached a certain age and therefore there's this like, well, I guess that's just not on the table anymore. And I think that a lot of people have gone ahead and done that because it's better. It's been, we've been conditioned not to talk about these things. And the notion that someone is growing older, especially someone who identifies as a woman growing older and going into a very erratic transformational phase, instead of that being something that is honored and supported, it's heckled and criticized and labeled as crazy or, crazy old lady. We say the crazy old woman or just being dismissed for, it's menopause. So just pay no attention to that. What's beautiful about what kind of time we're living in now is that there are so many more resources than there have ever been for people who cycle to really connect to, become educated about. There are incredible health practitioners, advocates, activists who are getting this information, publishing this information, just making it available to the public, people that work with women and people who cycle to just educate them and help guide them through this process, because the truth is that we can't really look to our established systems for that kind of support and information. It is still kind of a fringe topic. It is something that you do tend to have to look outside of the mainstream for, and that's okay. We know that this work takes time and that changing the story takes time, but it's so important to do so. So, there are wonderful resources that I will share with you, and they're not perfect resources, but they're wonderful resources and they have a lot of value. So I will share those with this podcast. So what happens with perimenopause when our hormone levels, our estrogen levels are really high at the very beginning of perimenopause and we're really overstimulated, and that may tend to heavier bleeding and actually It could even eventually lead to shorter cycles where you're menstruating every 20 something days or less, where bleeding becomes a little bit more erratic. Um, all of those may be signs of perimenopause, but they're also signs of a hormonal imbalance, and abnormal bleeding is not okay for most of our life phase. But now we come into this stage where we know that we're going to be building more tissue and our cycles might get heavier. And there is a level of, oh, okay, as long as I am following up and checking this out, it is normal, but let me make sure that I'm supporting myself so that I can, flush out estrogen and support my body in maintaining low inflammation and feeling as good as it can. And it can feel great. It's still, of course, it can feel great. There's so many ways to do that. Um, there's an over aggressiveness in the medical community to treat people who come to their doctors with cyclical issues and some mood discomforts around their cycles or frustration around their bleeding. There's this aggressiveness to just medicalize it and say, well, here's a birth control pill so you just stop having cycles, or here's an antidepressant so that you start feeling better, versus, okay, let's take a look at your whole body and what is happening and what is driving this. Because our body parts don't exist in any way isolated form, and our physical experiences are never ever isolated. They're going to be deeply connected to the rest of our body, to the rest of our experiences, whether it's the relationships that we're in and the work that we're doing, the amount of rest that we're getting, what we're eating, what we're exposed to externally and internally. So there is yet to be a very holistic, like integrated look at the human body, specifically bodies that cycle, that are even more and ever more sensitive to their environment, and that have been very, very much left out of medical research and medical studies. So the fact that gender bias is entrenched in our healthcare system is something to be deeply aware of, and also why I always advocate for becoming your best health advocate, your healthcare provider. You are your primary healthcare provider, and I will say that again and again. So it's up to you to understand what is happening in your body, gathering information, be it with the assistance and collaboration of other specialists, but ultimately how you decide to pursue your healing process and what medicines and types of medicines you choose to take, whether it's body work, meditation, herbs, pharmaceuticals, whatever it is, hormone replacement, that kind of inner guidance about what is right for you really needs to come from within, and not from a place of feeling really lost and just going with it because you're so desperate and you don't really know what's going on and you feel so confused about your body. And that is what tends to be the norm. I have so many students and clients that come to me and that's their story, just feeling kind of lost and thrown around, and within the medical community, having multiple specialists and just desperate to really get to the root cause of their symptoms, but feeling overwhelmed and confused and so disconnected from their bodies and what's going on, and feeling like it's this scattered, fractured puzzle, that piece, and there's something missing. The missing part is that it hasn't been put together, that it hasn't been looked at as a whole, and that those dots have not been connected fully. So that's what I think is really up to us, to become connected and wise and educated about our body and really understand health and healing. So when we talk about a stage of life that is very little respected and regarded, not only in our culture, in our society, and in our medical community, like menopause and the transition towards menopause and the time after menopause. And let me clarify. So I'm going to identify menopause as 1 year without menstruation. Now, this is not because you're in the middle of your 30s or 20s and all of a sudden you've missed your periods for a year. We're talking about someone who has been cycling regularly and then their cycles became a little bit different, a little bit more irregular, and then more sparse, like missing a month, missing 2 months, missing 3 months, and then eventually 6 months, 7, up to a year. Once you hit that 12 months with no menstrual cycle, you have essentially accomplished menopause. So you don't really know that you're in your menopausal year until after those 12 months. Once that has occurred, you are post-menopausal. So that's a clinical description of it. And again, it gets thrown around like I'm in menopause when you're really perimenopausal, that you're feeling that change in transition. Sometimes it's good to clarify, well, what do you mean exactly when you say perimenopause, or what do you mean when you say menopause or postmenopause, so that, you know, so that we understand that we're using a language that refers to something specifically. Sometimes even amongst healthcare providers, unless you take a moment to define that in that space, there can be confusion. So what happens after you stop cycling? Well, during that year of menopause, your body is adapting, like I mentioned, recalibrating to not having those high levels of estrogen and having barely any progesterone in its body anymore. So your brain has to use a new energy source or adapt to lower levels of the energy that it was using. And it can't do that. It doesn't mean that there's a decline. There may be a temporary, like, okay, wait, I'm readjusting. And if you've gone through a birthing journey, you know that the mom brain, the postpartum mom brain, it's like your brain is actually changing and adapting to new hormones and just a whole new environment inside of you and outside of you. And the same thing happens during menopause. So your body, your tissues, your bones, the way that your body uses energy, your metabolism, all of that is readjusting to very new levels. So there may be a temporary dip in its capacity where you're like, I am not able to do as much or feel the way I used to feel. There's something so different here. And instead of fearing that, like, is this my new normal forever? No, it shouldn't be. But going out of your way to acknowledge the transformation that your body's going through, and intentionally supporting it so that it does calibrate well, smoothly, quickly, efficiently. Maybe not quickly, I don't know that we can control that, but definitely efficiently, without added strain, without added stress. That is something that we can do. And honestly, that is something that we're always trying to do, because, the reality is that as people who cycle, our bodies are constantly struggling to find that inner balance given the world that we live in. There is a very silent epidemic of chronic hormonal problems amongst people who cycle and menstruate. And if you didn't know this, hysterectomy in this country is the second most common surgery performed after cesarean section. So the fact that so many uteruses are removed, and in many cases unnecessarily, absolutely, and I will say that unnecessarily, it's an over intervention of medicine in many regards. Not always, but that does happen. That tells you something about how ill-equipped Western medicine is when it comes to reproductive health, womb health, cyclical health. So I want to bring that to the forefront because if you dig into the history a little bit, you will know that this is a journey that has to be rooted in each and every cyclical person and woman who decides to take ownership and reclaim this process and their body and what it means to heal and what it means to feel dis-ease in our culture and how to tend to that from a place of understanding, from a place of power versus disempowerment and kind of absorbing a lot of the negative associations that have been attached to the female body, especially in medical culture. There's a long way to go, but I hope that during the next few months, we will be able to celebrate together, to celebrate an initiation that is unlike any other, which is crossing the threshold of menopause and enjoying a beautiful phase of life that occurs after menopause. And that is very little talked about, but can be so potent and beautiful and powerful. And, I think that it's other cyclical creatures that really are the first ones to be able to see it for what it really is. And it is a coming into full body power. And I love there are so many traditional cultures, but specifically the indigenous cultures based here in America that believed that the women who no longer menstruated was because they kept their powerful blood and they kept their power. It was no longer being released from their bodies. They held it inside. And therefore now they were the wisdom keepers of the tribe. And now they became the leaders and the council members and, the council of the wise grandmothers and beyond, because they had this experience and they had this magical wisdom within, very much connected to their menstrual bleeding, which, talk about a restorative, revitalizing, beautiful perspective of aging and growing older and becoming a wise woman compared to the invisibility that we're so afraid of, that we're told happens when you cross that threshold and you move into the invisible world of women, which is it is true. I'm not saying that it's just a perspective. I do believe and trust and know that it is an experience. It is a real experience in our culture, but it doesn't have to be that way. Of course it doesn't. And we can't wait for others to change it. The ones who know, the ones who remember, we're the ones who have to come together and talk about it and start telling new stories. So I think I'm gonna leave you with that. And I would love to hear from you if this brings up any just feelings or questions or comments or anything that you want to see in this upcoming season. Not only do we want to bring specialized healers and healthcare providers and wise women and wise gender fluid people who are connected to their cyclical bodies and want to talk about that from just so many perspectives, especially centered around menopausal change. I'm very excited about that because it's definitely something that's been much more in my space in the last few years. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with our wonderful BodyWise community. And this has been a pleasure. Thank you for listening to me just kind of muse and rant and just go off into the ethers a little bit with this. And I look forward to being on here soon with a special guest. So stay tuned. Bye.